Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC. We're thrilled to be joined by today's guest, Dr. Alan Finkel. Alan is, among many things, a neuroscientist, an engineer, an author, and an entrepreneur. He was Australia's chief scientist from 2016 to 20, led a landmark review of Australia's national electricity market, and developed Australia's first national hydrogen strategy. Alan's latest book is called Powering Up: Unleashing the Clean Energy Supply Chain, and it details how nations can practically transform from petrostates to clean energy electrostates. This conversation will largely focus on the ideas presented in the book. Alan, welcome to Energy Unplugged. Delighted you can join us.
Hugo, a pleasure to be here.
We're also joined today by James Ha, Aurora's research lead for Australia. Welcome, James.
Good to be here, Hugo.
Alan, if it's okay, let's start with the book, Powering Up. When you write about nations like Australia powering up, the future you're envisaging is one where we massively scale up the role of electricity in the global energy mix, and of course do that in a low emissions way. Working backwards from that endpoint, you've put forward your views on what needs to happen to get there and what opportunities there'll be for certain countries like Australia to become suppliers across the whole supply chain, from minerals to renewable energy to value-added products. I suppose, what inspired you to write the book, and what do you think is missing in the conversation now, the gap that the book fills, I suppose?
Hugo, the inspiration came from an event that I was asked to lead last year. I was invited by the then Prime Minister of Australia to chair the steering committee for a conference, which ultimately became called the Sydney Energy Forum. And that was a commitment that the Prime Minister made after he came out of a leaders meeting for the Quad. That's the Quadrilateral Security Group, which is America, Australia, Japan, and India. So President Biden, Prime Minister Modi, at the time was Prime Minister Suga in late 2021, and Prime Minister Scott Morrison. And Australia volunteered to run an international conference to look at the supply. Well, they decided at that conference that energy security was something they had to deal with. And to get, as a kickoff, they decided to do a conference that Australia would host on the supply chain across the Indo-Pacific that was critically important to the clean energy transition. Now, this is not something I had given a lot of thought to. As you said in your introductory comments, I've done a lot of work on electricity markets and policies and the stability and reliability and security of the electricity market. A lot of work on developing the National Hydrogen Strategy and Australia's low emissions technology roadmap. And I wrote a book called Getting to Zero to really show that there is a pathway to zero, certainly in the energy space. And don't forget, energy is nearly, or the use of fossil fuels is nearly 3/4 of all emissions. And I had written a book called Getting to Zero, which outlined that we have the technologies in hand. Of course, they need constant improvement for cost efficiency and performance, but we have the technologies in hand to get to zero. And I said in that book, this book is about technology. I acknowledge technology does not live in a vacuum, but I'll leave that to another day or to other people. But all of a sudden, through this conference that I was asked to chair, I had to become somewhat expert in the global or the Indo-Pacific supply chain. And there's not much difference between the global supply chain and the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is about 60% of everything there is. The conference was successful. There was a change of government in between, and the new government agreed that it was important. So Prime Minister Albanese, who won the election in May, hosted the dinner the night before, gave the launch speech. At some point, Secretary of Energy in America, Jennifer Granholm, found out about this. And despite the fact that it was a by invitation conference for captains of industry, she offered she would like to come. Of course, we were delighted. And then, of course, the Japanese energy minister and the Indian energy minister, we ended up with half a dozen energy ministers as well.
gate crashing your conference.
There's some gate crashes you just love to have. So I learned a lot. We all learned a lot. And then I'd finished. That was going to be the last thing that I was doing for the government. I was sort of retiring from government policy work. And I had a lot of things that I was doing, but a bit of spare time. And I had to decide, am I going to stare at my navel during that spare time or do something constructive? So I called up the publisher who had published Getting to Zero. And he had also published, not so long ago, the second book by Ross Garnaut, an eminent Australian economist, on Australia, the superpower. And he thought it was very timely. Australians, indeed everybody in the world, was very conscious of supply chain in a way that they never had been prior to COVID. But the shortages in COVID made people very aware, and that was exacerbated by the Ukraine war. So it was timely. People actually understood what supply chain issues meant, and he wanted to follow up with Ross Garnaut's book. So I agreed to do 50,000 words in 5 months, and like a good engineer, I delivered on time, but over budget. I did 110,000 words. I got into a frenzy because it's actually an interesting topic. It's a fascinating topic. Without the supply chain, we do not have the clean energy transition that we need to have. And you asked me, what is the essence of it? There's too many things to just say in one sentence, but everything has to work. We need, for example, electricity both as an end product and as a supply chain enabler, which means a critically important thing is being able to build the transmission lines to ship that clean energy from where it's produced to where we need it. And that's hard. The international supply of 500 kilovolt transformers is 5 years out. The skilled workforce, the linesmen to build those transmission lines, they're hard to find. So prices are exploding. So we've got this challenge between rolling out the clean energy transition as quickly as we can and not doing it at prices that make electricity so expensive that people, the general population, get angry and disaffected by the clean energy transition. There are a lot of balls to juggle.
Alan, maybe we could pick up on supply chains, because that's a topic we've discussed quite a few times on this show, and it's something that our clients are bringing up with us regularly. And for example, in Australia, we've seen cost estimates for new renewable projects and for transmission come in higher than everyone was expecting a few years back. And one example there would be, when the Australian energy market operator forecasts the cost of transmission projects, in their latest integrated system plan, they're expecting those costs to come in about 5 to 25% higher in real terms than they were forecasting 2 years ago. So how highly would you rank supply chain risks amongst the other risks facing the energy transition? Because you did, I guess, just mention, social license and keeping consumers, on board with the transition. Are there key concrete things that governments can do to mitigate the risks here?
James, on the example you gave of the transmission lines, some of the big ones that we're hoping to build at the 500,000 volt 2 gigawatts and above level, the prices haven't gone up just by a few percent. In the last 3 years, the prices have gone up 300% on the big ones. It's really dramatic. Now, AEMO may or may not be correct in forecasting modest increases 10, 20% in the next several years, but the record of the last 3 or 4 years is stunningly bad in terms of the increases. And it's all those things. It's the cost of steel for pylons, it's the cost of cables, it's the cost of transformers, it's the workforce. But for reasons that I'm yet to get to the bottom of, but I'm working on, it's much more expensive in Australia than it is in America. I've recently done a comparative study of comparable high voltage transmission lines that cross state borders from Arizona to California or from Wyoming to Utah to Nevada. Similar voltage and power, using unionized labor, meeting all the regulatory requirements, and the cost of doing those transmission lines in Australia is 3 or 4 times higher. And this might be a warning for some other countries. I don't know for sure, but I think it's a little bit of everything, but probably the biggest thing is that our regulatory system is ponderous and slow, and that adds costs because it was designed for the coal-fired electricity market back in the 1990s. And whilst it's been tweaked, the tweaking has meant that we now have 2,000 pages of rules for the national electricity market. So that actually makes things worse, not better. But we don't have enough competition. We've got the regulated monopolies, and they're verified by the regulator to make sure that they're not in any way claiming charges that they didn't actually expend money on. I think they're completely honest, but they're not motivated to minimize costs because they're going to get a regulated return for whatever they spend. And we do not have a fully contestable process for contracting out the construction of the transmission lines. It would be much better to run for an independent party to run a competitive process to get the lowest price for construction, allow that construction to proceed, and then transfer the asset to the monopoly transmission line company, rather than what we do is make it the responsibility of the monopoly transmission line company to do the best they can to build the transmission lines. So it's a serious problem. You also mentioned social license. It's becoming very, very difficult. None of the big transmission line projects that we've been planning for several years have actually commenced. They haven't been able to get the final approval from the landholders who are affected. The landholders could be farmers, some of whom are delighted to take easement payments and transit payments. They're called transit payments. I call them a toll tax, just like in the old ancient Rome, where you tax people for using the roads you're going through, that they were using going through your property. So there is money on the table, but a lot of the farmers are fairly wealthy and they don't care. They just don't want the amenity disruption of the transmission lines coming through their property and the utilization disruption to their property. Some of them are city-owned farms, and the amount of money that the government and the companies are going to pay is just not enough to make a difference to them. Some of the land is indigenous land and their requirements are complex and difficult to meet. So we haven't started anything. So we've got the double problem of time taken and high cost for when it does take place.
It's very surprising to hear that Australia is so much more expensive than the US, given that we tend to hear the US is quite expensive on other construction metrics, for transport infrastructure, say. And I'm sure there's some Australia-specific factors there, and it's interesting to hear that you're going to be digging into them. One of the things you mentioned there was around competitive procurement of transmission. Is there maybe an argument as well for a Team Australia approach here and some level of coordination, given that we're a relatively small country in the scheme of things? Should we be thinking about bulk procurement of the components that we're going to need to upgrade our transmission system, even though notionally the responsibility sits with different transmission providers in each state?
James, all of the above. So in terms of coordination, they're actually hoping to start the construction of two big transmission lines, one in Victoria and one in New South Wales, pretty soon. It would be, I think, more sensible to commit to doing one followed by the other. So you can invest in the apprentices and the experts and build a workforce to build the first one, and then use that same workforce and so have a workforce that has continuous employment prospects over the years, rather than doing everything at once and then standing down the workforce and then bring them on again, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a shortage of workforce skilled personnel in every sector of the economy, including this sector. So we've got to be very smart. So I think that coordination would help. In principle, a role for government procurement would be to say, okay, we know we're going to build X kilometres of transmission lines and we're going to have this number of substations and this number of starting points and end points. Maybe the government could put some money on the table and buy the transformers, the 500 kilovolt transformers, which apparently have a 5-year lead time, and stockpile them and then sell them to the project as the project has a need for them. So yes, there are some thoughtful things that could be done. Going back to the very start of your question on competitiveness, I think that when things are competitive, well, we all know that when things are competitive, it makes a difference. Let me give you an example where Australia is magnificently competitive, and that's the iron ore export industry. So more than 50% of exported iron ore is Australian iron ore. Now, most of that comes from the Pilbara, which for your international listeners is out in the outback in Western Australia. And the workers are entitled to pretty high rates of pay. They're skilled and very highly paid workers, and the companies fly them in and fly them out. So there's not only the high salary structure in Australia and all the safety and appropriate requirements, but there's this additional loading of the camps and the planes and the being away from home loading, the fly in, fly out costs. So we've got an intrinsically high cost labor force, and yet our cost of production of iron ore is less than the world average and less than the cost of production in Brazil, which is our biggest competitor. Why? I think the answer is that it's a ferociously competitive international market. And the Australian miners, the 4 big Australian iron ore miners, have responded to that by investing in automation, in remote control, in algorithmic process control, in artificial intelligence. So they're incredibly efficient because of that intense international competition for this gigantic market. It works. So because of the competition, we're a world low-cost supplier. If we could have the benefit of that type of competition in some of our domestic projects, I believe we would benefit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good link back to your earlier point about the role of technology. And I guess as an example of seeing competition actually lead to innovation and the deployment, the more rapid deployment of technology. The Pilbara is something I looked at a while ago. The salaries there, as you say, are incredibly high at every skill level. You would expect easily a 6-figure salary for the median worker in that part of the world. I think if we could turn to, still thinking about the Pilbara and the opportunities for Australia in a decarbonising future, one of the ideas that was kind of most evocative in your book was this idea of Australia shipping sunshine around the world. And there's a whole spectrum of forms that could take, from underlying commodities like electricity or molecules like hydrogen, more to the value-adding processes of, for example, converting iron ore to direct reduced iron, and then right to the end-use products, manufacturing batteries, manufacturing solar panels. So I guess along that spectrum, where would you be most enthused about Australia's opportunities?
There are many. I tend to use a couple of phrases that I go back to again and again. So that opportunity, I call it shipping sunshine, because for us, the electricity is going to come from solar panels or from wind turbines. Solar panels are obviously turning sunshine into energy, but so are wind turbines, because the wind is due to the sun heating land and causing convection, which then ultimately powers the wind turbine. So wind electricity is coming from sunshine. And we have an opportunity to be an electrostate of the future. And there are at least 3 versions or interpretations of electrostate. So one is to ship that sunshine in the most direct way possible, which is by converting water into hydrogen using electrolysis. That hydrogen has captured the sunshine and we can send it as an energy vector. But it's expensive. There are arguments for doing that by then further processing the hydrogen to make ammonia, which historically has been made as a chemical for producing fertilizer, but you can also use ammonia as an energy vector. So relatively efficient ways for us to ship non-carbon energy would be as hydrogen or ammonia. There has been speculative discussions about sending Australian electricity by undersea cable all the way to Singapore, 4,000 kilometers away, but it's just, I can't use any other word but to say it's insanely expensive to do that. It's just not practical. Even shipping hydrogen would be significantly more cost effective, and you've got the added benefit when you're shipping that shiploads can be redirected depending on short-term spot market offers and security issues and things like that. So shipping sunshine as hydrogen or as ammonia, but you can also ship energy by combining that hydrogen with carbon to make more sophisticated liquid fuels. So I'm thinking about methanol for the marine industry and jet fuel for long distance aviation. Jet fuel is the most exciting. Let's talk about both of them. There are two ways you can get a sustainable methanol. One is from biomass, which still needs hydrogen, because the old-fashioned ways of making biomass, you do not get a high-quality product. But if you use hydrogen-treated modern processes, you get a methanol, which is a drop-in replacement for fossil methanol. And ships are already being converted to be able to run on conventional bunker fuel or methanol, depending what's available. So biomethanol, which is hydrogen-treated biomass, is increasingly likely to be used in the international maritime fleet. Ultimately, we might be able to make synthetic methanol by combining carbon dioxide from the air or carbon dioxide from another waste source with hydrogen to create that methanol. But the ultimate difficult to abate sector or mitigate sector is long distance aviation. And there they need jet fuel, but jet fuel is actually kerosene. It's a saturated hydrocarbon. There are only two elements in jet fuel, carbon and hydrogen. There are three things: there's hydrogen, carbon, and the energy that binds them together. So you can make, and that's called kerosene, by the way. So highly refined jet fuel is kerosene. And you can make it from biomass using hydrogen treatment and get a drop-in jet fuel, and that's exciting. But if the maritime fleet and the aviation fleet and maybe long-distance transport and maybe reticulated gas systems are all trying to get their fundamental energy source from biomass, there's not enough biomass.
Especially in Australia, I imagine, where, compared to other parts of the world, the amount of biomass we produce per square kilometre across most of the continent is probably not very high. And then you run into the tyranny of distance of trying to get the biomass from diffuse locations to places where you process it.
That is correct. But one thing we don't have a shortage of, James, is solar electricity and wind electricity, and especially solar electricity, which can be eventually done at very, very low prices. To be economical in these futuristic fuels, you need to be down to about $10 US per megawatt hour, which means you're not going to do it connected to a national grid of some kind. This is going to be off grid in major locations where you do everything in an integrated plant, and the only connections are the wires between your solar plant, your electrolysis plant, and your synthesis plant. I call this ultimate goal of creating synthetic jet fuel the ancient Greek Archimedes principle of modern aviation fuels. Why do I say that? Because the ingredients are air, water, and fire, which are three of the four elements from ancient Greece. So the air is where we get the carbon dioxide. And we get the carbon dioxide by doing direct air capture. I'm sure you've discussed this on the program with other people. Highly energy intensive. You've got to bring the air to membranes, capture the carbon dioxide, and separate it. And the fire that drives that process is the solar electricity. The water is the water that we use to produce hydrogen. So we take more fire, split the water, get the hydrogen. So now we've got a source of carbon, we've got a source of water, a source of hydrogen. With more fire, we can drive a synthesis process and make saturated hydrogen carbon, so that you've got the air, water, and fire. And it's ideal. It's ideal because it's a truly carbon neutral process. For example, if you took 634 molecules of carbon dioxide from the air and use that with the appropriate number of hydrogen molecules to make a tiny, tiny droplet of jet fuel, when that tiny, tiny droplet of jet fuel burns up in the stratosphere in the engine, you get the energy you want for the forward thrust, and you release 634 molecules of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. It's truly carbon neutral. No other system will give you that level of 100% carbon neutrality. So it is the ideal. It's the holy grail. But at the moment, it's inconceivably expensive to do that. But a lot of people around the world are working on it.
And I think that probably sounds like an opportunity that is going to require a lot of scaling up and projects that can help bring that technology down the cost curve. If you could maybe rank the opportunities for Australia, where would e-fuels sit in the next decade, say? compared to other uses of, our renewable resource?
So it would sit there out at the end. It would be one of the last things that we do because it's just not cost effective at the moment. As I said, it is the holy grail. The ancient Greeks were very patient, James. We'll have to be patient too. Look, the other two ways that we can become an electrostate is, first of all, by using hydrogen and renewable energy to produce decarbonized commodities. You already mentioned one, green iron, and the other would be green fertilizer. There are others, of course, too, green alumina, etc. Green iron is a particularly interesting one. Steel making is responsible for about 8% of global carbon dioxide emission. That's a lot. That's a lot from one subsector of industry. Steel making is a two-step process, and it's historically done at integrated plants. The first step is to convert rust that comes out of the ground, otherwise known as iron ore or iron oxide. So we dig rust out of the ground, and that gets converted in a blast furnace to iron, and then in a basic oxygen furnace or electric arc furnace into steel. Take Australia. We ship the iron ore. Over 50% of the traded iron ore comes from Australia, and we ship metallurgical coal. And it's very cheap to ship. Basically, we put 200,000 tons of iron ore into a big bucket with a propeller and send it to a country such as Japan, Korea, or China, or elsewhere. We put a couple of 100,000 tons or thereabouts of metallurgical coal, which is high-grade coal, 90% or more carbon, into another big bucket with a propeller. And those ships are very, very cheap. The cost of shipping is trivial, and the recipient or the importing country does the whole job. To decarbonize the process, you have to focus on the first step. Most of the 8%, but not all of it, but most of that 8% comes from the reduction of the iron oxide into elemental or metallic iron. And I see that we're going to have to split the process geographically and do the first step here in Australia. And the second step should continue to be done in the countries that historically make steel. The reason being that making the green iron is likely to require lots and lots and lots of hydrogen. And shipping hydrogen is expensive. I speak to a lot of people about this, and most of them have some confidence that we will one day get to the magic price point of $1 US per kilogram of hydrogen at the production facility. But most of them also, those who have done studies, think that it'll be $2.50, maybe $3 in the long term for shipping a kilogram of hydrogen. And maybe $1, $2, or $3 for pipelining hydrogen. So if Japan, for example, was to import hydrogen from Australia, their landed cost would be $4, which is very expensive if they're going to use it to make iron, to make steel. So it makes sense for Japan to co-invest in Australia in a joint venture to do the first step here. The first step is to take the iron ore. It's complicated because it depends whether it's magnetite or whether it's hematite, whether you do it as pellets or as fines, and then to process that with hydrogen. Now, what happens in a conventional blast furnace, you put in nearly pure carbon, so let's just call it coke, made from metallurgical coal, hundreds of tons. You put in hundreds of tons of the iron ore, the ferric oxide. You light the proverbial match, and that whole mixture starts to heat up as the carbon burns. And that's where you get about 4 of the 8 percentage points of carbon dioxide. It's the heat that the carbon does to heat it up to 15 or 1600 degrees Celsius, at which point it all melts. And then something different happens. The remaining half of carbon starts to act as a chemical. And the carbon says, look, I can see oxygen atoms on that iron oxide. I want those oxygen atoms, and it grabs them and turns itself into carbon dioxide and goes off into the atmosphere. And that's called reduction, as in oxidation and reduction. So the carbon is used to chemically reduce the iron ore, and that leaves behind the metal, the metallic iron, which is what you want. And let me call that green iron. And iron is iron is iron. It doesn't matter how you make it, whether you make the iron in a blast furnace or in a hydrogen direct reduced drop furnace, or in future, maybe it'll be done through a direct electrochemical process. There's a company called Boston Metals who's been developing this for a long, long time, a little bit like aluminium smelting, where you just use electricity to reduce the iron oxide to metallic iron. Doesn't matter how you make it. Iron is iron is iron. But steel is not steel is not steel. There are many, many different alloys, because steel is made by taking metallic iron as the bulk ingredient, adding a bit of carbon, molybdenum, chromium, nickel, manganese. And there are many different grades of steel. There's cheap steel that's used as rods in reinforced concrete, all the way through to the most exotic, which is medical grade stainless steel. And there's many different shapes: rolled steel, girder steel, etc., etc. So the steel making should stay in the countries where it's been done effectively to date, where they know their markets. But the iron making can come to Australia. So that's a huge opportunity for Australia, as an example. And then there is another way a third way we can become an electrostate, and that's providing the energy transition materials. Some people refer to critical materials or critical minerals. I don't like that term because it's ill-defined. Every country defines critical minerals differently depending on their needs. But energy transition materials, you can categorize them. Battery materials is a category of energy transition materials. The world needs lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt, graphite, all those things. And Australia has abundant deposits of nearly all of that. There's a real shift because of the IRA and the European interests towards getting those materials refined in friendly countries, if you like, using low emissions energy. And that's an opportunity that Australia can capture. We should talk about the IRA, but it's a whole topic on its own, in its own right. So. But the IRA is to some extent an anti-China bill. It's a climate policy bill, and it's a Made in America bill. So they're trying to reduce their dependence on China. And at the moment, take lithium. We are now the biggest exporter of lithium rock called spodumene, and that means we're the biggest exporter of lithium in that spodumene. But it typically goes from here to China, and from China to somewhere in America or somewhere in Europe as lithium hydroxide. Just in the last year, we've seen 3 plants in Australia, in Western Australia, go into production, initially in small quantities, but it's going to increase, to convert the spodumene, the lithium rock, into lithium hydroxide here, ready to be shipped and used directly in battery factories as one of the key input chemicals. So there's really increasing and ultimately huge opportunity for Australia to add value. We talked about adding value in making green iron, but adding value in producing lithium hydroxide instead of lithium ore, nickel sulfate instead of nickel ore, rare earth elements instead of the rare earth ore. So that's the third way we can be an electrostate.
Fantastic. I have to say, Alan, this does give me flashbacks to my 3 years of a chemistry degree, hearing about reduction and oxidation and the opportunities that we've got. I think let's pick up on the IRA point then, because we do seem to be in a new era of industrial policy. And this concept of friend-shoring, of diversifying where your supply chains are and hosting them in friendly countries. I mean, it's great if you are a friendly country to the US at the moment. I mean, closer to home, Australia has a $2 billion hydrogen Head Start program. In Europe, they've got a Critical Raw Minerals Act. So, there is a level at which governments are intervening in these supply chains. I wanted to talk about the policies you think are going to be most effective to help nations like Australia become electrostates in the future. And the thing that I noticed, one of the things I noticed reading your book was some criticisms of a lever that economists and many of the people at Aurora are economists. One of the levers they're most favorable towards is carbon pricing. How has your thinking around this changed over time? And what do you think would be the appropriate basket of policies today to help countries transition towards being electrostates?
So I haven't had a strong opinion over the years until I got involved in the Sydney Energy Forum last year about carbon pricing, whether it's carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. But I do recall more than 10 years ago coming across the writings of Dieter Helm, a professor from Oxford University, and he was writing.
The founder of Aurora, Alan, as well. So,
well, there you go. Take that as an unpaid advertisement. And his writings have been really thoughtful and seminal on what you need to do to make an effective carbon tax. He referred to it as the carbon consumption tax, but it's really manifesting itself now as the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But basically, for a carbon tax to be effective, it's got to be economy-wide. It's got to be in every country, and it's got to be without exceptions. Now, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the consumption tax that Dieter Helm was recommending, compensates for it not being in every country. But at least within a given country, it's got to be economy-wide and without exceptions. Otherwise, some companies will do the right thing and conscientiously improve their processes to reduce their emissions so they don't have to buy the credits or pay the taxes. Others will simply buy offsets. Others will just eat it and pass the cost on to the consumer. You're not necessarily, there's no guaranteed cause and effect. There's no guaranteed reduction in emissions through a carbon pricing mechanism, as I, as an engineer, see it. But what we're seeing now, we've seen it for decades, but it's become very visible through the IRA, is the incredibly important role that subsidies have. Goes back earlier than this, but certainly in the 1990s and the early 2000s, Germany just stimulated the solar panel industry through the feed-in tariffs they offered, massive feed-in tariffs, which had a 10 or a 20-year lifetime.
Yeah, very generous.
It cost the German economy, I think, a couple of $100 billion. And unfortunately for Germany, they didn't capture the long-term industry capability. It went across to China, but it's a gift to the planet, because through that subsidy, we've had enormous uptake of solar, and that's measurable. Every gigawatt hour of solar production is a gigawatt hour of fossil fuel production you don't need. So you've got a clear cause and effect between subsidies that I don't see from carbon pricing. Similarly, Denmark and the UK did a lot with subsidies for wind, and China, through the combination not of carbon taxes, but the combination of subsidies and mandates at the central government and the provincial government and the city government level, have driven their industries to adopt low emissions technologies. Partly it was because they wanted to clear up particulates from their atmosphere. And then the central government saw there's real business opportunity here, export opportunity here, if we can encourage this. And America has seen this too. Now, you could argue that the reason why the IRA has no carbon taxes whatsoever, or carbon prices whatsoever, is because they had to appease the Republican Party people. But for whatever reason, the IRA is likely to be $1 trillion US dollars of expenditure over the next decade, all going into subsidies. And it's just a no-brainer that subsidies for producing green hydrogen at less than 0.45 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per kilogram of hydrogen produced is lowering emissions for the benefit of the planet. So to me, there's this crystal clear correlation between subsidies for low emissions technologies and outcomes that's hard to see. One of the things I mentioned in the book was I thought I'll look at the World Bank report on carbon pricing, and they put out a big report every year. And if you read through it, you see the excitement about the expansion of the number of programs and the increased billions of dollars going through the program. They don't mention emissions reduction in the whole report. They don't suggest that there's a linkage between the carbon pricing schemes and emissions reduction. And that silence to me is deafening. I could be overinterpreting. But it's strange that it's not referred to. So in the book, I call that carrots versus sticks. And as a good parent, I was brought up to take the carrot approach rather than the stick approach with my children.
Maybe blended with a few standards, right? A few mandates, carrots and sticks, but also there's a baseline rule.
Well, expectations.
It's a good way to put it.
Alan, in the interest of time then, let's kick off maybe with just a few rapid fire questions. So first up, if there was one energy technology breakthrough for the energy transition available, what would be number one on your list?
Batteries, and it's happening already. It's just stunning what's happening with batteries. We've seen in the last 2 years a shift from 90% of all batteries being lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese formulations to lithium ferrous phosphate. That takes out 2 of the 3 expensive metals. And this year, the 2 biggest company manufacturers in the world, CATL and BYD, have started to produce sodium ferrous phosphate batteries. That takes out the last expensive metal. Now, there'll still be huge demand for the lithium formulations because you get better energy density per kilogram. But in terms of lowering costs, if you're using sodium ferrous phosphates, you have no expensive materials. It's all earth abundant. Nothing is nasty if it's left in a landfill or whatever. So those batteries will be used for grid scale storage, behind the meter storage, community batteries, as well as vehicles. But it's the grid applications that I find very, very exciting.
Yeah, cheaper and longer duration batteries as well. Investment and then divestment have been hot topics in Australia. So, the idea that publicly listed firms divesting themselves of assets, but then other buyers, often privately owned, buying them. How do we kind of get around this problem, I suppose? Like, how should ESG investors think about the investments they make to solve this problem?
Hugo, that's a particularly important question. So, as you've already articulated, there's 2 players in divestment. So if a company that's currently got a lot of oil, coal or gas assets under shareholder pressure or investor pressure divests those assets, somebody buys them, typically a private equity company or a state-owned company, not subject to public scrutiny. It's proven and obviously likely that they will operate those facilities at a lower standard, and thus the planet is worse off when those companies are forced to divest. And I think the problem is driven by 2 things: naivety amongst activists who think that that's sending a message.
Yep.
It sends a message, but it's possibly the wrong message because that those assets will continue to be operated. But it's also the ESG system's fault. ESG investing is typically what I call single materiality. They're focused on risk to the company because of shareholder activists or lack of access to funds rather than risk to the planet. They can't swing across and just look at risk to the planet. They have to use double materiality considerations. They've really got to say, look, you need to either wind down your high emissions operations or commit to using the revenue from those high emissions operations to invest in new low emissions technology that will make those high emissions operations ultimately obsolete. Have to go from a single materiality focus that just looks at risk to the company to double materiality, looking at both risk to the company and risk to the planet.
Which is at least a little bit more what Brookfield's been talking about in their purchase of Origin as a really tangible example in Australia at the moment. Energy modeling. This is a bit inside baseball, but where do you think long-term techno-economic energy modeling is or isn't useful?
Hugo, it's not something I think about a lot, but I tell you one place where it would be one place would be really useful is to do some, not so much the modeling, but some benchmarking, because if you don't know that you're paying too much for something, you won't do the measures that you need to take. You won't undertake the measures you need to in order to do something about it. So I take the Australian case with transmission lines we were talking about, or pumped hydroelectricity. My back of the envelope modeling is we're paying 3 or 4 times more than comparable projects in America. And now that we know that, well, I'm in the process of trying to bring it to the attention of others, but once they know that, they have to do something about it. You can't fix a problem if you don't recognize the problem. I'm trained as an engineer, and I always follow the engineering model. It's 5 steps. And the first one sounds incredibly trite. The first step in the engineering method is to identify the problem. Then you analyze it and come up with a solution, test it, iterate, and ultimately deliver an outcome. But if you don't identify the problem, how do you make progress? And I think there's a glibness in the system, both at the industry level, the regulator level, or in all levels, the industry, the regulators, and the governments, that just accepts unreasonably high prices and tries to move on rather than to tackle the problem. So if through modeling, you can first identify the problem, then analyze it, and through your modeling, propose some solutions, that would be a gift to the energy transition.
No, completely agree. And then those numbers you've quoted are certainly striking, although in some ways not surprising. One final question. Who do you read or listen to in the energy space that's always good, thought-provoking, and relevant to your work? We've given Sir Dieter a shout out. Is there anyone else that springs to mind?
You'd be surprised. I find that the masthead Australian papers carry a lot of stories that are broad and current. So the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, I balance the Australian by reading the Guardian. There's a industry newsletter called Energy Insider that Energy Networks Australia collaboratively puts out with the Australian Energy Council. And that has 3 tidbits of information every week. It's terrific.
That's a great recommendation. I'll add that to my subscription list. Not that I get through my reading list anyway. Alan, that's been terrific. We've taken an enormous amount of your time, but learned a huge amount. We're enormously appreciative. All the best, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Hugo and James.
Yeah, thanks, James.
Thanks, Hugo.
That was Dr. Alan Finkel, Special Advisor to the Australian Government on Low Emissions Technologies, talking to Aurora's Hugo Batten, Managing Director for APAC, and James Haar, Research Lead for Australia. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.